Thanks so much. First of all, I'd just like to congratulate Pegasus on a really good piece of work. I was able to read quite a bit of a very thick document that they produced called a research monograph, and there was a lot of richness which has been shared in this presentation, but it obviously goes beyond that. I work for an organization called ICLEI, and we work with over 1,500 local governments from around the world. My particular office works mainly in Africa, and so in reflecting on these research findings, I thought it would be useful to just have two reflections that, yes, based on this research, but also some of the discussions yesterday and some of the broader work that ICLEI is doing in Africa that I hope would be useful to this audience. The first area that I'd just like to chat to is this area of barriers and enablers to change. And a lot of these barriers or challenges and enablers have been discussed by the Pegasus presenters. And I think it's important that we acknowledge these issues and that there's greater research into how we can unlock change in African cities. In ICLEI, we found that in particular barriers, they seem to nest around three areas. The one are to do with resources, and that's spoken about a lot. Human resources, as was discussed yesterday. Are there enough staff? Are they trained at the right level? Are they paid the right salary so they stay within municipalities? There's obviously financial resource barriers, but we're often told that this is not the whole story, that there's other things at play. Within that also is knowledge and communication, and I think that's what this research was also pointing to, is the necessity of linking municipalities to local university institutes and building research in that fashion. Something else that really struck me yesterday was speaking about the link between municipalities and communities and how absolutely essential that is to harness change, and those mechanisms aren't as well developed as they should be, and we know this is a challenge. There's technological challenges within the resource group that was highlighted in relation to this piece of research. But for me, some of the more fundamental barriers are more social related, things like cognitive issues, how we perceive challenges. I was struck by some reflections yesterday afternoon around what is the lens through which we do research in Africa. If we're using a Western Northern lens, are we really understanding the changes that are happening in Africa in a more nuanced way? And I think that's an important question. These cognitive barriers are often the underlying barriers. They're difficult to research, they're difficult to understand, and they're difficult to overcome. But I think if we don't start engaging with perceptions, we're not going to solve the problem. Within that category, there's also normative challenges. That's to do with tradition, culture. Again, that was touched on in this research in relation to traditional cooking and being sensitive to that when we come with solutions. And then organizational challenges, and I think that's been a lot of what we've discussed over the last day. What are those structural issues within cities that are hindering the change that we require? But perhaps more important to me than these barriers are what are the enablers of change? And I think this is where our research should really grow. For us, we found that it's where you've got engaged municipal officials that are often working above and beyond their daily pay grade or their daily hours that you really see change in municipalities. And it's those champions that we should encourage and work with more as organizations across different sectors. Also enabling organizational environments where change can occur around the edges that eventually leads to transformation. Partnerships and networks are absolutely essential. A lot of them are set up at conferences like this and taken forward. Windows of opportunity are essential. We've seen in a lot of African countries that when there's a major flood or a major disaster, as terrible as that may be, if your champions are able to utilize that opportunity, which raises something like climate change to the forefront of decision makers' minds, that window of opportunity can be used for change within our cities. And then lastly is projects with ancillary benefits. And I think the point here is that in the developing world context, we have to implement programs and projects and research that has multiple benefits at multiple time scales for multiple stakeholders. Simply implementing a project just for climate change that's going to happen in 100 years' time is not effective in African cities that have so many challenges. My second reflection was around methodology and around research, particularly because this was a research paper. And it's around a lot of our work shifting towards what is called co-production or transdisciplinary work. And I hate jargon, but essentially what it means is trying to bring stakeholders on board right at the very beginning of the process and involve them throughout the research or policy or implementation process. That means asking the stakeholders what are their research questions that they can't answer and tailoring our research and our policy and our practice around that. It's this two-way exchange of knowledge. It's the walking the road with the stakeholders that for me is absolutely essential. But there's this juxtaposition of the urgency of change, which we know needs to happen now and needs to happen quickly, and the fact that these processes take time. It takes time to walk this road with stakeholders. And then my last point was just around a lot of research and policy, particularly in the climate change field, is calling for upscaling and outscaling. This idea that we need to make changes fast and across the world and reach as many regions as we possibly can. But I'm always held by this fact that we just realize in our work that context is absolutely essential. And within every city and across cities, within every country, the context is vital. And if you don't take into account the nuanced context of where you're working, your change is unlikely to be sustainable. And so what sticks with me, perhaps, is more a term of deep scaling. And perhaps we should be doing work that is deeper in cities, that is longer in cities, where we walk the road for longer periods of time, as opposed to, and yes, with up and out scaling, but the importance of context for me can never be underestimated, and I think this research also highlighted that. Thank you.